Hello and welcome to Introduction to Sociology. Today we're going to be talking about the socialization process. So again, remember from last week we talked about culture, and culture is a common way of life. Okay? So the socialization is the process by which we learn and internalize that common way of life. Okay? So the process of learning and accommodating culture. The way the socialization process occurs, it's through social interaction. Okay? Think about when somebody's born as a baby. Who's interacting with the baby? You have your primary agents of socialization, your parents. Then, as that child grows up, starts to interact with other people, grandparents, extended family members, friends, then they kind of become 5 or 6. They start, developing that peer group, which becomes incredibly important in the teenage years. Okay. So this process of socialization extends throughout the lifespan, okay? But essentially, it's learning about our culture, learning about our way of life. So again, that's learning the knowledge, learning the language, learning the value systems, beliefs, attitudes, how things work, what you're supposed to do with your life. What are the expectations? What are the rules? And so by the time we all finish high school, of course, we all know the rules. We know that you can't commit crimes, you can't murder, you're not supposed to hit, you're supposed to be nice and kind. You're taught that you're supposed to get married, you're taught that you're supposed to be heterosexual. That's a little bit of a critique, okay? Because again, the dominant culture, that's what all of us are socialized into. And so again, in the United States, we are all socialized into the isms also. Racism, sexism, heterosexism. Okay? This, standard common way of life, this cookie cutter way of life that we all are being taught our entire lives. And so most of us, who you are, your identity is based upon how you were socialized into your culture, how you were socialized into this way of life. And a lot of us, I bet, never even ask questions about what we were told, if that's even accurate. Do I really have to get married? I mean, I know that when I look out at society, I've been socialized my whole life that I'm supposed to get married, have 2.5 kids, and a Honda Civic, and a white picket fence, and all these material items, or I'm nobody. This is what I've heard my entire life. But when I step back and I ask, is that really what life's all about? Or is that just what I was socialized my entire life? Then I start asking questions. For example, I mean, am I white? I was told my whole life I was white. But then when I read a book, I was like, I'm not white. If I have any race at all, I'm mestizo. I'm European mixed with Native American. I mean, am I white? White's not even a race, it's an ethnicity. So again, a lot of the stuff you were told in your life, it's just what you were told. These are this is the culture of the dominant social class that's in power. And you've seen us challenging things for years now, to the extent that heterosexism, the idea that everybody's supposed to be monogamous and married and straight, has been absolutely challenged. 80% of white marriages, 50% of African American and Hispanic marriages all break up. So if monogamous nuclear family that was perfect and cookie cutter was really the end all be all right way, then we would all be doing it. But it turns out that not everyone in modern times is really identifying with the dominant culture. So even though we were socialized into this way of life in which we were, kind of told to be prejudiced and discriminatory toward people that identify as homosexual, toward people that identify as non-white, we are completely questioning this socialization process. And that's imperative because if you're going to deconstruct racism, if you're going to deconstruct sexism, these negative attitudes toward women, if you're going to deconstruct, negative attitudes towards sexual orientations other than straight to create a better society, we have to question the socialization process. We have to question the culture that we're being socialized into. Okay? So your identity, who you are, develops as you interact with other people. You have this genetic personality. Okay, yes, your genes are absolutely influenced with your behavior, but your experiences in the social context through interacting with other people, this is where your identity really forms. And when we get into groups, I'm going to talk a lot more about prejudice and discrimination and things like that, because the groups that you identify with, that's where your culture lies. So if you identify as black, you then identify with black culture, you then adopt the way of life of black culture, and therefore you end up thinking of yourself as black. Okay? So I will talk a lot more about that when we get into groups, because group identification is incredibly important to understand human behavior and the way we think and the way we behave, for example. But for now, we'll just talk about how your identity, who you are, develops as you interact with other people. So your genetic identity, your chromosomes and the way they influence your behavior, for example, is a major component of your identity, but it's not the end all be all. The rest of you has been formed by interacting with other people, and then you consciously interpreting things and unconsciously internalizing things. Okay? So, the socialization is a way of communicating a variety of cultural variables. So, again, we're not born racist. We are taught to be racist. We are socialized into racist ideology. So, again, that's the idea of questioning things like race. Because if you're going to deconstruct racism, you not only have to deconstruct the categories of race and just, prove that they don't accurately group people according to biological traits, but you also have to undo all the old outdated knowledge about race in our culture. The idea that someone who's white and black are genetically different is completely inaccurate. But you're told your whole life that a white person is different than a black person. And here I am telling you that's not true. Again, you might have to study that a little bit. Okay. But the socialization process is lifelong. Hence, me in my 20s, all of a sudden deciding that I'm no longer white. Just I had to change. I had learned some new information. Okay. So the socialization process is a biopsychosocial process. Okay, so sociobiology is the idea of, again, how much of your biology influences your behavior, how much of your biology is associated with social interaction, being social, for example. Okay, so one of the questions we'll ask is, why is being social built into human biology? And again, we can look at evolutionary psychology to really start to address these questions, because we can ask, first and foremost, how does being social help us survive? And why do we get brain rewards when we're social, for example? Because these reward systems that are built in, these biological needs for attachment, they are built in. So us needing somebody in our life, there's a reason we need someone in our life. There's a reason we want to be part of society, that we want to belong to a group, because that's part of human nature. That's built into our biology. So the question of, do we need others? Absolutely. A baby will not develop without social interaction. They've had the really sad child abuse studies of where, kids have been locked in the closets, and if you don't interact with the child, it has detrimental effects. And if you haven't fully interacted with that child by the time they're like age 4 and 5, that has permanent effects. They will permanently have mental disabilities going throughout their life, which is incredibly sad. But even so, if we're not connected to society, if we're disconnected from groups of people, we experience anomie, that just kind of in between, what's wrong with me? Well, maybe I just haven't seen anybody. And so I'm lonely all of a sudden. So anomie is that disconnect, okay? So again, isolation is not good for humanity. We need to be around other people. And the rhesus monkey experiment by Harry Harlow is one of the best ones, because the rhesus monkey experiment, so that was done with a wire monkey and a cloth monkey, and so they had this baby monkey, and they would give the wire monkey food, and the cloth monkey would just have warmth and comfort, and the rhesus monkey would spend 90% of the time with the comfort monkey and only 10% of the time with the monkey for food. So, do you need your mother more for attachment or for food? And it turns out attachment. 90% to like 10%. We only want our mothers 10% for food. The rest is we want love. We need to be part of other people. It's built into our biology, okay? So social psychology is super fun. Again, we'll talk about this throughout the semester, but we'll introduce Freud first. Freud talks about the id, the superego, and the superego. The best way I like to think about this is the id is like your inner self, your biological self, all those desires, your body releasing hormones that's motivating you as your hormones travel up the bloodstream to your brain, that motivates your behavior. That's your id, your inner self. And your superego is your social self. That's you kind of standing outside the box, looking in, saying, okay, how am I acting? Do people like me? Am I playing this role pretty well? Okay, good. And your ego, that's the inner self that's talking to the superego. Okay, so the ego is like the moderator between your inner self and your social self. And the best example I can give of this is, think like if I'm out and I really like someone across the room and I'm like, wow, that person's super attractive. And my inner self is like, go up and talk to that person, tell them you love them right away. And your super ego's like, whoa, dude, you can't just go up to someone across the room just because you think they're attractive and tell them that you're in love with them on the first date. You got to be like, hi, how you doing? Where are you from? Do you want to go hang out and get a cup of coffee sometimes? So, your super ego is your social self saying, inner desires, despite your desperation to go out and ask this person out, you have to play it cool. And so the one that's moderating between your social self and your inner self is your ego. Okay. So the development of people in stages was proposed by Piaget and Kohlberg. And this is the idea that as you evolve over time, your cognitive development occurs over time. So as we interact with society, we go through these stages. At first it's no language. Then once we can start to use language, we can start to interact more. Then we start doing some basic problem solving, about ages 7 to 12. After that, we start being able to do abstract thinking, to be able to kind of think outside the box. That doesn't really develop until you're about 12. Okay, so there's a couple different theories of development and stages between Piaget and Kohlberg. They each kind of have their own mix. But the real question is, do we actually develop in these specific stages, or is it, again, just kind of like a process? Because not everybody develops at the same rate. The human development is a process, but there are some general epochs, some general steps that we do over time accomplish. We learn to walk, we learn to talk, then we learn to, do some problem solving, then we start to learn right from wrong, then we start to use abstract thinking where we can question the rules. Okay, so I mean, it's a big debate as to whether we develop in clear cut stages. And so now they, instead of like developmental psychology, they call it lifespan psychology, because we all develop throughout the lifespan. But still, there are, it's an interesting way to approach and categorize development by looking at it as a stage theory. Okay. Gilligan proposed gender and moral development. Again, the process of learning the rules of society, the process of learning what sex you are, and then learning what the sex appropriate rules are, the sex appropriate expectations are for men and for women. Okay. And again, so begins gender roles and the idea of men becoming breadwinners and women becoming homemakers. We're all socialized into gender roles based upon, our assigned biological sex. Okay. And if you deviate from those gender roles, you often get socially controlled. For example, I was with my daughter and we were at the toy store, and there's two aisles of girl toys. And this dad walked by with his son, and he's like, you haven't looked at all the aisles. Let's look at all the aisles before you pick out your toy. And as they were walking by, they were like, oh, that's a girl's aisle. We better stay away from there. And the boy kind of looked at his father like, yeah, dad, we better stay away from there. And all I'm thinking in my head is, well, I take my daughter through the boy aisles and the girl aisles because I don't necessarily want her, being socialized into clear cut gender roles. I don't necessarily want her only adopting the expectations of females. I want her to come up with her own way of life and decide for herself what kind of role she wants to play. However, it's not always that easy because, again, all of us are socialized into racist ideology, just like we're all socialized into what gender role ideology of specific sex is supposed to play. Is it acceptable for a dad to stay home with the kids while the wife works? Or is there stigma attached to that? So, again, anything that deviates from the social norms, we generally have stigmas attached to that and sanctions attached to that also to socially control any behavior that deviates from the norms, which we'll talk about in deviance when we get there in a couple weeks, things about week 8. So, my favorite two theories that are really relevant for sociology are Cooley and Mead, the looking glass self and the generalized other. So, your identity, who you are, and how you feel about yourself is influenced by how you think other people think about you. Okay? So, if I look out and I look out at society and I say, how does society view me? What do you see reflected back? Okay? And where it gets really dark, okay, is when you start looking at that same question, but you look at it through the lens of race or sexual orientation. If I'm gay and I say, how does society feel about me? What is reflected back for someone that identifies as gay? Do they see nothing but positive things, wonderful attitudes toward people that identify as homosexual? Or do they also see the prejudice, the discrimination, the stigmatization? When a black male looks out and says, how does American society feel about black men? What does a black male see reflected back? And again, this is where we need social change because that breaks my heart. The stereotypes that are attached to groups. When a woman looks out and says, how does society feel about women? What do they see reflected back? It's not always positive. Okay, but that's sad. I have a daughter. I want her to be able to look out and hear nothing but positive things. Instead, what's she going to hear? Boys are better at girls than math. Boys are stronger than girls, and that saddens me. But that's the socialization process. We're all socialized into these sexist ideologies that we have to undo to make a more equitable world for people that are females and non-white, non-straight, for example. Mead takes that same concept of saying, how do people feel about me? But he says it's more about how the significant people in your life feel about you, the significant others. And so the generalized others, think about how all the people that matter to you in your life feel about you. Okay? That's what you're seeing reflected back. But the main point of all of this is your identity, your self esteem, how you feel about yourself is highly influenced by how you think other people feel about you. So again, this is why like how a teacher feels about a kid in their in their classroom, for example, matters so much because if a teacher looks at them with bright eyes and positivity, that child's going to feel like they're somebody. But if the teacher looks at them like they're an idiot, how's that child going to feel about themselves? Okay, so all of us are susceptible to group influence, to social influences, to the attitudes and beliefs of other people. Even if we want to say you don't care how people think about you, you do. Okay, you are constantly questioning, how do other people feel about me? Do they like me? Do they think I'm cool? Do they think I'm somebody? Do they think I have status? You care, even if you don't want to care, okay? Mead also talks about the I and the me. Again, the I is your inner self, the me is the social self. A little bit more of a simple version on Freud's id ego and superego. So again, theoretical perspectives of socialization. From a functionalist perspective, what's the purpose of the socialization process? Again, the purpose is to socialize a culture, to socialize a way of life, to be able to transmit knowledge from generation to generation, to teach people and prepare people to take on social roles in society, etc. Conflict theories, again, is going to talk about the purpose of socialization is to support the dominant group in power. Negative attitudes toward women support male domination. Negative attitudes toward non-whites support white privilege. Okay? So conflict theory is going to focus on, how the process of socialization supports the dominant group in power to help them maintain power. And symbolic interactionism is going to say, look, guys, we're the ones who socialize the children. If you want all the kids to believe in themselves, stop socializing negative attitudes, for example. Okay. So again, the socialization process, culture, the way we teach people, the education system, we're the ones who made that. If the education system is failing 65% of people, is that really a good thing? Because only 35% of people graduate college, okay? So are we really socializing people knowledge if only 60 or if 65% of people don't get a college degree? Or does the education system really just serve the rich? Because of those, 100%, only 35% get to compete for the better jobs that require a college degree, for example. So you have your agents of socialization again from birth, you have people that are interacting with you. Those people you're interacting with, those are your agents of socialization. And not just people, but it could also be books and media and things along those lines. But again, books and media are all created by people. It just might not be a direct communication with somebody, but still that book made by somebody, that TV show made by somebody influences you, influences the way you think, influences your attitudes and beliefs, for example. Again, I thought I was white until I read some books, and then I was like, hold on here, I'm not actually white. What's up? What's a mestizo? I've never heard of mestizo. Gets me thinking a little bit, okay? So we have our primary agents of socialization. Again, this is like your immediate family, the people that are closest to you. Then you have your secondary agents of socialization, like people at your job, people at your school. Okay, society is a group of people. We are all influenced by the larger society. You have your peers, you have the mass media. Okay, so anything to do with people that you were exposed to that, have stimulate you in any way, shape, form, or fashion, they are agents of socialization. Okay. So again, as we talked about, there's a lot of forms of socialization, but the book talks about gender socialization. How do we know how to behave based upon what sex we are? What are the expectations of men and women and intersex? Sexuality socialization. This idea that our sexuality is socially controlled, that we are all expected to be monogamous and to get married, etc. I just wrote a paper on consensual non-monogamy versus monogamy and the stigmatization attached to consensual non-monogamy, like polyamory and open relationships, for example. But, and the big part of that paper was the idea that, all of our sexuality is socialized. Like what's acceptable, what's right and wrong, how we're supposed to be is socialized. And in a lot of my intro classes, I ask questions, like how many partners is acceptable for a female? How many partners is acceptable for a male? Well, how do we know the answer to that? Well, we were all socialized that a woman is supposed to have like one partner and a man is supposed to have dozens. And I don't understand why, but that's just the socialization process. That's the dominant culture speaking out. And again, we should be questioning a lot of these things because what happens to a girl that, had sex with more than one person, for example? How do they treat her? And, I hear the negative words. You can probably imagine the negative words. I don't want to repeat them so much. But again, it's because, if a woman doesn't match the sexual expectations of society, what do they do? Socially control you, sanction you, okay? So we all have these rules that we're socialized into, okay? Anticipatory socialization, your book talks about, that's the idea of setting people up for the future. So, we're socializing our children to learn math and to sit in a chair so that when they get older, they can go sit in a cubicle and do math at an insurance company somewhere so they can, make enough money to be able to take care of their family in a capitalist economy. Okay. And then resocialization, again, that's what I've been talking about this whole time. I had to resocialize myself because the more I learned, the more I had to undo all the old knowledge. Like I thought I was white, then it turns out I'm not. So what do you think about that? Hence resocialization, changing your attitudes and beliefs, changing your way of life, changing your culture, changing the way you think about things. Okay. So the book concludes the chapter with talking about age categories, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, late adulthood, older adulthood, and then also ageism, again, prejudice and discrimination toward people. Uh, it can be young or old because there's a lot of prejudice and discrimination against teenagers just as much as they are against people that are in older adulthood, for example. Okay? So again, social change. How has the socialization process changed? Well, back in the day, again, just think about all the variables that I'm always talking about: race, sex, sexual orientation. Back in the day, we were all socialized to believe that being gay was deviant. And if somebody that was gay had a psychological disorder, do we still label somebody that identifies as gay with a psychological disorder, or have our attitudes changed? Thank God our attitudes have changed because it's absolutely not a disorder. That's completely insane. Being gay is highly influenced by our genetics, just like every other part of our sexuality is influenced by our genetics. So, I mean, it's not just some socio-cultural phenomena. Like being gay is not just a choice at all. There is a lot of genetics involved, okay? And so we are less intolerant as a society. However, there's still prejudice and discrimination against people that identify as gay, despite how our attitudes have changed. Our attitudes toward non whites have changed. However, prejudice and discrimination still exists. Our sexist attitudes toward women has reduced. However, there's still prejudice and discrimination against women. So we've had three waves of feminism, civil rights movements, hundreds of years of movements, okay? It has made things better, but still not perfect. There's a lot more room to change, okay? So this socialization process that we're being socialized into this common way of life still causes harm to certain groups that experience stigmatization as a result of prejudice and discrimination for their common way of life, okay? Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please email me. Have a wonderful day.